The sky above Earth turned dark with ships that did not belong there. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the defense station and watched as hundreds of alien vessels emerged from nowhere. They were massive, each one the size of a small city, and they moved with purpose toward the planet below. Jake had been a commander in Earth's defense fleet for 12 years. He had trained for this moment, though he never truly believed it would come. First contact with alien life was supposed to be a moment of wonder and discovery. Instead, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The alien ships opened fire without warning. Orbital stations exploded in brilliant flashes of light. Jake watched as 3 of his sister ships were torn apart by weapons that moved faster than anything human technology could track. He grabbed the communications panel and shouted orders to his crew, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were meaningless. This was not a battle. It was an extermination. The aliens called themselves the Vakreen Empire. They broadcast a message in perfect English, which told Jake they had been watching humanity for some time. The message was simple and cold. Earth would surrender immediately. Humans would serve the Vakreen or they would die. There was no room for negotiation or discussion. Jake's station lasted another 20 minutes before the hull was breached. He ordered his crew to the escape pods, but most never made it. The Vakreen weapons cut through the station like paper. Jake found himself floating in space, watching his home burn below him. Cities that had stood for thousands of years were being reduced to ash and rubble. Down on Earth's surface, Lisa Grant was having the worst day of her life. She was a colonel in the military, stationed at a command bunker deep beneath the Colorado mountains. The bunker was supposed to be safe, protected by layers of rock and steel. But as the Vakreen ships began their bombardment, Lisa realized that nowhere was truly safe anymore. The screens in the command center showed destruction on a scale that seemed impossible. New York was gone. London was gone. Tokyo, Moscow, Sydney, all gone within the first hour. The Vakreen were not trying to conquer Earth. They were trying to break it. Lisa received reports from surviving military units around the world. Every major base had been hit. Every naval fleet had been sunk. Every Air Force squadron had been shot down. In less than 3 days, the combined military might of humanity had been reduced to scattered groups of survivors hiding in ruins. The governing council tried to coordinate a response, but they were vaporized when a Vakreen weapon struck their bunker. Lisa watched it happen on a live feed. One moment, the council members were discussing evacuation plans. The next moment, the feed went to static. She was alone in the command center now, the highest-ranking officer left alive. The Vakreen ground forces landed on the 4th day. They came down in massive transports that settled over major cities like dark clouds. The aliens themselves were tall and insectoid with hard shells and multiple limbs. They moved with frightening speed and carried weapons that could cut through concrete and steel. Jake Morrison had made it back to Earth in an escape pod. He crashed in what used to be Pennsylvania and spent 2 days walking through the ruins. He saw the Vakreen soldiers up close for the first time when he stumbled upon a patrol. They were searching through a destroyed neighborhood looking for survivors. Jake hid behind a collapsed wall and watched. The Vakreen moved with confidence like they owned the planet already. One of them found a family hiding in a basement. The father tried to fight back with a rifle. The Vakreen soldier simply pointed its weapon and fired. The family disappeared in a flash of energy. Jake felt something break inside him at that moment. These creatures had destroyed his world, killed his crew, and now they were hunting down the survivors like animals. He had no weapon, no plan, and no hope. But he had something else. He had rage. Lisa Grant received a transmission on the emergency frequency. It was from scattered military units, civilian groups, anyone with a radio who was still alive. They all asked the same question. What do we do now? How do we fight back? Lisa sat in the command bunker and thought about that question. The conventional war was over. Humanity had lost in less than a week. Every doctrine, every strategy, every plan had failed. The Vakreen were too strong, too advanced, too numerous. But then Lisa remembered something from her history classes back before the world ended. Throughout human history, there had been wars where the stronger side lost. Empires had fallen to smaller groups who refused to fight fair. Armies had been defeated by enemies who would not stand and face them in open battle. It was called guerrilla warfare, and it was humanity's last hope. Lisa began sending out new orders on the emergency frequency. Stop trying to fight like soldiers, she told them. Start fighting like survivors. Hit the enemy where they are weak. Strike fast and disappear. Use the land, use the ruins, use anything you can find. Make them pay for every inch of ground. The Vakrine commander was called Thraka. He stood in his command ship and looked down at the broken planet below. This had been easier than expected. 47 worlds had fallen to the Vakrine Empire, and Earth was just another conquest. The humans had fought bravely, but bravery meant nothing against superior technology. Thraka sent his soldiers to establish occupation zones. They would take control of the remaining population centers and put the surviving humans to work. Earth had resources the Empire needed. The humans would mine, build, and serve. Those who cooperated would live. Those who resisted would die. It was simple, but Thraka had made a mistake. He thought the war was over. He thought that destroying Earth's military meant the fight was done. He did not understand humans. He did not know their history. He did not realize that for thousands of years, humans had been fighting and killing each other in every way imaginable. They knew how to wage war without armies. They knew how to turn anything into a weapon. They knew how to hate. Jake Morrison met other survivors in the ruins. They were soldiers, civilians, people who had lost everything. They gathered in the shell of a burned-out building and shared what little food they had. Someone asked Jake what they should do. Should they surrender? Should they try to escape? Jake looked at the faces around him. These people were scared and broken, but they were also angry. He told them about the family he had watched die. He told them about his crew, his friends, everyone he had lost. Then he told them that the Vakrine had made a mistake. They had left humans alive. The group decided that night to fight back. They had no plan, no weapons, and no chance of winning. But they would fight anyway, because the alternative was to give up, to let the Vakrine win without making them bleed for it. And humans, Jake realized, were very good at making their enemies bleed. Lisa Grant sat alone in the command bunker and listened to reports coming in from around the world. Small groups were forming. Survivors were gathering, and they were starting to fight back in small ways. A Vakrine patrol ambushed here, a supply truck destroyed there. It was nothing compared to the massive invasion force, but it was something. She thought about what humanity would have to become to survive this war. They would have to give up the rules of civilized warfare. They would have to embrace brutality and cunning. They would have to become monsters. But maybe, Lisa thought, that was exactly what Earth needed right now. Not heroes, not soldiers, but monsters who refused to die. 6 months had passed since the Vakrine invasion began, and the world had changed in ways that seemed impossible. The cities were now occupied zones filled with alien soldiers and their machines. But in the spaces between, in the mountains and forests and deserts, humanity was learning to survive. Danny Cooper had been a Marine before the invasion. Now he was something else entirely. He led a group of 30 people through the Appalachian Mountains, moving from place to place like shadows. They lived in caves and abandoned buildings, always ready to run at a moment's notice. The group had learned quickly that staying in one place meant death. The Vakrine had sensors that could detect large gatherings of humans. They had flying drones that patrolled the wilderness areas. Any group that got comfortable, that built a permanent camp, was usually dead within a week. Danny's second in command was a woman named Karen Walsh. Before the invasion, she had been an engineer at a power plant. Now she spent her days taking apart Vakrine equipment and figuring out how it worked. She had a talent for understanding alien technology, and she used that talent to build weapons. Karen had discovered that Vakrine power cells could be modified to create explosives. They were not as powerful as military-grade bombs, but they were good enough. She taught the others how to make them, how to set timers, how to place them for maximum damage. Every piece of Vakrine technology they captured became a potential weapon. The third key member of Danny's group was Pete Johnson. He had been a hunter and wilderness guide before the invasion, and those skills were invaluable now. Pete could move through the forest without making a sound. He could track the Vakrine patrols and predict their movements. He taught the others how to hide, how to cover their tracks, how to become invisible. The group conducted their first major attack on a Vakrine supply depot outside of what used to be Charlotte. They had been watching the depot for 3 weeks, learning the patrol patterns and guard rotations. Karen had built 6 bombs from salvaged power cells. Pete had mapped out 3 escape routes through the surrounding forest. They struck at night when the Vakrine guards were changing shifts. Danny led half the group in from the north while Pete took the others around to the south. Karen stayed back with the bombs, ready to detonate them remotely. The attack lasted less than 10 minutes. Danny's team took out the guards at the north entrance with silenced weapons they had scavenged from dead soldiers. They placed Karen's bombs on the supply crates and the fuel storage tanks. Pete's team did the same on the south side. Then they ran. Karen waited until both teams were clear before triggering the bombs. The explosion lit up the night sky. Secondary explosions followed as the fuel tanks ignited. The depot burned for hours. 20 Vakrin soldiers died in the blast or the fires that followed. Danny's group was 5 miles away before the Vakrin reinforcements arrived. They split into smaller groups and took different paths through the mountains. They met up 2 days later at a prearranged location. Everyone had made it out alive. News of the attack spread through the resistance network. Other groups began launching similar operations. In the Australian outback, a group led by Greg Martinez used the harsh desert environment to their advantage. They led Vakrin patrols into the deep desert, where the heat and lack of water killed the aliens more effectively than any weapon. In Siberia, a woman named Nina Volkov had organized the survivors into a network of cells that struck during the brutal winter months. The Vakrin could not handle the extreme cold. Their equipment froze and malfunctioned. Their soldiers moved slowly and clumsily. Nina's fighters attacked supply lines and isolated outposts, always during the worst storms. The pattern was becoming clear across the planet. Humans were not trying to win battles anymore. They were trying to make the occupation as painful and expensive as possible. Every Vakrin soldier killed was a small victory. Every supply convoy destroyed meant resources the aliens had to replace. Thraka, the Vakrin commander, began to realize he had a problem. His forces controlled the major cities, but they could not control the wilderness areas. His soldiers were being killed in small groups, picked off by an enemy that refused to fight fair. Supply lines were constantly under attack. Equipment was being sabotaged. Captured technology was being used against them. He ordered reprisals against human settlements suspected of supporting the resistance. Entire towns were destroyed, their populations executed. But this strategy backfired. For every human killed in reprisal, 10 more joined the resistance. The Vakrin were creating their own enemies. Danny Cooper's group grew larger as more survivors found their way to the mountains. Some were former soldiers like Danny. Others were civilians who had lost everything and wanted revenge. A few were just scared people looking for protection. Danny took them all in and trained them. The training was brutal. Danny knew that anyone who could not keep up would get themselves and others killed. They learned to march for days with little food or water. They learned to sleep in the cold and rain. They learned to move silently and strike without hesitation. Those who could not adapt were sent to safer locations where they could support the resistance in other ways. Karen Walsh became increasingly important to the operation. She had figured out how to hack into Vakrin communication systems using captured equipment. This allowed the group to listen in on enemy transmissions and learn about patrol schedules, supply routes, and weak points in their defenses. One intercept revealed that a Vakrin commander would be traveling through their area in 3 days. It was too good an opportunity to pass up. Danny decided they would attempt an ambush. Pete scouted the route and found a perfect location. The road passed through a narrow valley with steep sides. Karen prepared special explosives designed to create landslides. The plan was simple: bury the convoy under tons of rock and escape before reinforcements arrived. The ambush went perfectly at first. The convoy entered the valley right on schedule. Karen triggered the explosives. The hillsides collapsed, crushing several vehicles and blocking both ends of the valley. The Vakrin soldiers who survived the initial landslide were trapped. Danny's fighters opened fire from the high ground. The Vakrin returned fire, but they were pinned down with no cover. The battle lasted 20 minutes. When it was over, 35 Vakrin soldiers were dead, including the commander they had been targeting, but the victory came at a cost. 2 of Danny's fighters were killed in the exchange of fire. Another was badly wounded. They carried her for 6 miles before she died. Danny ordered her buried in a secret location with the others they had lost. There was no time for proper funerals anymore. Lisa Grant, coordinating resistance efforts from her command bunker, received reports of successful operations from around the world. The Vakrin were losing hundreds of soldiers every week to guerrilla attacks. Their supply situation was becoming critical. Their soldiers were demoralized and afraid to patrol in certain areas, but Lisa also received darker reports. Some resistance groups were becoming more brutal in their tactics. Captured Vakrine soldiers were being tortured for information and then killed. Humans suspected of collaborating with the aliens were being executed without trial. The line between resistance fighter and terrorist was becoming blurred. Lisa struggled with these reports. Part of her knew that this brutality was necessary. The Vakrine had no mercy, so why should humans show any? But another part of her worried about what humanity was becoming. If they won this war, what kind of people would they be afterward? A Vakrine intelligence officer named Vril was assigned to study the human resistance. He spent months analyzing their tactics and trying to understand their thinking. His reports to Thraka grew increasingly concerned. The humans, Vril wrote, did not fight like any enemy the Vakrine had faced before. They had no honor, no rules, no predictable patterns. They used their own weakness as a strength, hiding among civilian populations and blending into hostile terrain. They turned everything into a weapon, from captured equipment to the environment itself. Most disturbing to Vril was the human willingness to sacrifice themselves. Vakrine soldiers fought for the Empire, but they expected to survive and be rewarded. Human fighters seemed to have no such expectation. They threw themselves into battles they could not win, accepting death if they could take Vakrine with them. Thraka read Vril's reports with growing unease. The occupation of Earth was supposed to be routine, but it was turning into a quagmire. He had lost more soldiers on this one planet than he had on the previous 5 conquests combined, and the humans showed no signs of giving up. Back in the mountains, Danny Cooper gathered his fighters around a small fire. They were tired, hungry, and scared. But they were also proud. They had survived 6 months against impossible odds. They had learned to fight back. They had become something the Vakrine had not expected. Danny looked at the faces around the fire and saw how they had changed. These were not the same people who had stumbled into the mountains 6 months ago. They were harder now, colder. They had learned to kill without hesitation. They had learned to live with loss. They had learned to be guerrilla fighters. Karen sat beside him, cleaning a captured Vakrine weapon. Pete was already asleep, exhausted from days of scouting. The others talked quietly among themselves. 2 years had passed since the Vakrine invasion, and the resistance had evolved into something terrifying. The scattered groups of survivors had become organized networks of fighters who knew every trick of guerrilla warfare. They no longer fought to survive. They fought to make the Vakrine suffer. Lisa Grant had moved her command center 3 times in those 2 years. The Vakrine kept getting closer to finding her, so she stayed mobile. She now coordinated resistance activities across the entire planet, using a network of radio relays and human couriers. No electronic communications that the aliens could intercept. Every message was hand-delivered or transmitted in brief coded bursts. The resistance had learned to be patient. They would watch a Vakrine position for months before striking. They would map out every guard rotation, every weakness, every potential escape route. When they finally attacked, it was with overwhelming force and perfect timing. Then they would vanish before reinforcements could arrive. Danny Cooper's group had grown to over 100 fighters. They had become legends in the resistance network. Other groups wanted to know their methods, their tactics. Danny had started training new cells, teaching them everything he had learned about surviving and fighting in the wilderness. But the cost of success was high. Danny barely recognized himself anymore when he looked in a mirror. His eyes were cold and hard. He had killed so many Vakrine soldiers that he had stopped counting. He had sent dozens of his own people to their deaths on missions that needed to be done. The weight of those decisions never got easier to carry. Karen Walsh had become a master at creating improvised weapons and explosives. She could build a bomb from almost anything now. She had also become frighteningly good at psychological warfare. Her latest creation was a device that broadcast sounds that drove the Vakrine crazy with fear. They did not know what the sounds meant, but their instincts told them danger was near. The resistance had learned to use fear as a weapon. They would leave dead Vakrine soldiers displayed in ways meant to intimidate. They would attack at night because the aliens had poor vision in darkness. They would use hit-and-run tactics that kept the enemy always on edge, never knowing when or where the next attack would come. Pete Johnson had become the group's top scout and assassin. He could get within feet of a Vakrine patrol without being detected. He had killed over 50 enemy soldiers in silent, close-quarters combat. He taught others his skills, creating a generation of human hunters who stalked the aliens like prey. One mission stood out in Danny's memory. Intelligence reports said a Vacrine regional commander was visiting a base in what used to be Virginia. Lisa Grant herself had approved the operation. Take out the commander and as many of his staff as possible. Danny selected 20 of his best fighters for the mission. They spent 6 weeks infiltrating the area, moving slowly and carefully. They posed as scavengers, people the Vacrine mostly ignored because they seemed harmless. They mapped every entrance and exit to the base. They identified the building where the commander would be staying. The plan was insane. They would hide inside a shipment of salvaged materials being delivered to the base. Once inside, they would wait until night and then strike. They would have maybe 20 minutes before the base went into lockdown. That had to be enough time to kill the commander and escape. Everything went according to plan at first. The salvage truck was waved through security with barely a glance. Danny and his team climbed out of their hiding spots inside the cargo and moved through the base like ghosts. They had studied the layout so many times that they could have walked it blindfolded. They found the commander in a command center with 16 other officers. Danny's team opened fire without warning. The Vacrine never had a chance. 17 aliens died in less than 30 seconds. Then the real challenge began. Getting out. Alarms blared throughout the base. Vacrine soldiers poured into the corridors. Danny's team split into 3 groups and took separate escape routes through maintenance tunnels they had identified during surveillance. They had to fight their way through checkpoints and security doors, but they had surprise and desperation on their side. 16 of the 20 fighters made it out. 4 died buying time for the others to escape. Danny stood outside the base perimeter and watched it burn from the explosives Karen had planted during their infiltration. 4 more names to add to the list of people he had gotten killed. But the mission was a success. The Vacrine regional commander was dead. His staff was dead. The base was heavily damaged. And the message was clear. Nowhere was safe. No one was beyond the reach of human revenge. The Vacrine response was brutal. They destroyed 3 human settlements in reprisal, killing everyone they found. Over 2,000 people died. Lisa Grant listened to the reports and felt nothing. She had become numb to death. It was just numbers now. Tallies in a war that had no end in sight. She authorized operations that would have horrified her before the invasion. When the Vacrine tried to establish a collaborator government with humans willing to work with them, Lisa sent operatives to assassinate every collaborator they could find. 23 people died in a single night. The message to other humans was clear. There was no middle ground. You were either resistance or enemy. A young woman named Amy Stevens joined Danny's group during this time. She had been 12 when the invasion began. Now she was 17 and had known nothing but war for her teenage years. She was small and quiet, but she had a talent for killing that unsettled even the hardest fighters in the group. Amy showed no hesitation, no fear, no remorse. She could shoot a Vacrine soldier in the face from 10 feet away and then sit down to eat lunch without her hands shaking. Danny realized with horror that an entire generation was growing up like this. Children who had learned to kill before they learned to drive. What would they become when the war was over? The Vacrine tried different approaches to break the resistance. They offered rewards for information about rebel hideouts. They promised amnesty to fighters who surrendered. They tried to negotiate through intermediaries, offering to leave parts of the planet if humans stopped attacking. Lisa Grant received the Vacrine peace offer on a data chip delivered by a neutral party. She read it carefully. They offered to withdraw from North and South America if the resistance ceased operations in those regions. It was actually a reasonable offer. Half the planet in exchange for peace. She destroyed the data chip without responding. There would be no peace while a single Vacrine remained on Earth. No negotiation. No compromise. Every alien would leave or die. That was the only acceptable outcome. The Vacrine intelligence officer Vril continued his reports about human behavior. He had come to a disturbing conclusion. The humans were not fighting a war anymore. They were waging a campaign of extermination. They wanted every Vacrine dead, and they were willing to sacrifice anything to achieve that goal. Vril's final report was found after his death in an ambush. In it, he wrote that humans had no conventional military weakness. They were too adaptable, too creative, too willing to do whatever was necessary. He recommended that the Vacrine Empire classify Earth as unsuitable for conquest and withdraw all forces immediately. But Thraka could not accept that recommendation. The Empire had never abandoned a conquest. To do so would show weakness. Other species might rebel if they saw that the Vakreen could be defeated. So Thraka dug in and prepared for a long occupation, hoping to eventually break the human will to resist. He did not understand that the human will was not something that could be broken. It could only be hardened into something darker and more dangerous. Pete Johnson led a mission to destroy a Vakreen cloning facility that produced their shock troops. The facility was in what used to be Chicago, deep in Vakreen-controlled territory. Getting there required Pete's team to fight through streets filled with enemy patrols and surveillance equipment. They succeeded in destroying the facility, setting back Vakreen reinforcement capabilities by months, but the cost was terrible. Pete's team of 15 fighters was reduced to 4 by the time they escaped the city. Pete himself was badly wounded, shot twice while covering the retreat of his teammates. He knew he could not make it out. The wounds were too serious and he would slow the others down, so Pete made a decision. He would stay behind and hold off the pursuers. Give his team the time they needed to reach safety. Danny listened to Pete's last transmission over the radio. His friend's voice was weak but steady. He said the same thing he always said before a mission. Make it worth it. Then the transmission ended in gunfire. Danny stood in the ruins of a building 50 miles away and felt something break inside him. Pete had been with him since the beginning. They had survived together, fought together, lost people together. Now Pete was gone, sacrificed so that 4 other fighters could escape. Karen found Danny sitting alone that night. She did not say anything. She just sat beside him in the darkness. After a long silence, Danny spoke. He said that he barely remembered who he used to be before the war. The person he had been was gone, replaced by this thing that only knew how to fight and hate. Karen told him that she understood. She had changed too. They all had. She said that maybe that was okay. Maybe they needed to become monsters to fight monsters. Maybe that was the only way humanity would. 3.5 years after the invasion began, humanity had shed the last traces of mercy and compassion when dealing with the Vakreen. The Resistance operated with cold efficiency, having learned that sentimentality was a luxury they could not afford. Lisa Grant sat in her current command bunker, located somewhere in the Canadian wilderness, and reviewed reports from resistance cells around the world. The numbers told a story of relentless grinding warfare. The Vakreen had lost over 40,000 soldiers on Earth. Their supply lines were in constant chaos. Their morale was shattered, but they still held the major cities and showed no signs of leaving. Lisa made decisions now that would have been unthinkable before the war. When resistance fighters were captured and tortured by the Vakreen, she ordered immediate strikes on Vakreen medical facilities in retaliation. Eye for an eye, pain for pain. The rules of civilized warfare had been abandoned long ago. A courier arrived with a request from a cell in South America. They had identified a Vakreen commander who was known for his brutal treatment of human prisoners. The cell wanted permission to capture him alive and make an example of him. Lisa approved the request without hesitation. Let the Vakreen see what happened to those who tortured humans. Danny Cooper had become something he barely recognized. His group now numbered over 200 fighters, split into multiple cells that operated independently but coordinated their actions. He had trained dozens of resistance fighters who had gone on to lead their own groups. He was a legend in the resistance, the man who had never lost a major operation. But the legend did not sleep well at night. Danny woke up most nights in a cold sweat, seeing the faces of people he had killed or gotten killed. The count was in the hundreds now. Vakreen soldiers, human collaborators, even some resistance fighters who had become liabilities. All dead because of orders he had given. Karen Walsh rarely left her workshop anymore. She had become obsessed with creating more effective ways to kill the Vakreen. Her latest invention was a chemical weapon derived from earth plants that the aliens found toxic. It was not immediately lethal, but it caused horrible suffering before death. Karen tested it on captured Vakreen soldiers and documented the results with scientific detachment. When Danny questioned whether they should be using chemical weapons, Karen looked at him with eyes that had gone flat and dead. She asked him if he remembered what the Vakreen had done to Earth in the first week of the invasion. She asked if he remembered the families burned alive, the children crushed under rubble, the prisoners tortured for sport. Then she went back to her work. Amy Stevens had become one of the deadliest fighters in the Resistance at just 17 years old. She led her own team now, conducting operations that required absolute ruthlessness. She never hesitated, never questioned orders, never showed any emotion. The other fighters were afraid of her. One mission required Amy's team to infiltrate a Vacrine-controlled city and eliminate a target. The problem was that the target was meeting with human collaborators. Amy's orders were clear. Kill everyone in the room. No witnesses, no survivors. Her team completed the mission perfectly. The Vacrine target died along with 6 human collaborators. Amy walked out of that building with blood on her hands and went straight to the next mission. When someone asked her later if she felt anything about killing other humans, she said that collaborators had stopped being human the moment they chose to help the Vacrine. The Vacrine tried one more time to negotiate. Thraka sent a message directly to Lisa Grant, bypassing all intermediaries. He acknowledged that the occupation was not going as planned. He offered significant concessions. The Vacrine would withdraw from 3 continents. They would release all human prisoners. They would provide resources to help rebuild. All they asked in return was that the Resistance stop attacking and allow peaceful coexistence. Lisa read the message 3 times. It was more than she had expected to ever achieve. 3 continents. That was most of the human population. They could rebuild. They could start over. All they had to do was let the Vacrine keep part of Earth. She thought about it for exactly 10 seconds before sending her reply. No deal. Not 3 continents. Not 2, not 1. Every Vacrine would leave Earth or die on Earth. There was no third option. She ended the transmission and went back to planning the next wave of attacks. The Vacrine leadership was shocked by the rejection. They had conquered 47 worlds. Many of those conquests had ended with negotiated settlements where both sides found acceptable terms. But the humans would not negotiate. They would not compromise. They would not stop fighting until they won everything or lost everything. Thraka received orders from the Empire to increase pressure on the human resistance. He was given access to weapons and tactics that had been deemed too extreme for previous operations. The Empire was tired of the Earth problem. They wanted it resolved, whatever the cost. The Vacrine deployed a new weapon, orbital strike platforms that could target specific locations with pinpoint accuracy. They began systematically destroying areas known to harbor resistance fighters. Entire forests were burned. Mountain ranges were leveled. The Vacrine were willing to destroy Earth rather than give it back to the humans. Lisa watched the reports of destruction and knew that humanity was running out of time. The Vacrine could not win the ground war, but they could make Earth uninhabitable. She needed a way to strike back that would force them to leave. She needed something that would hurt the Vacrine so badly that staying on Earth would be impossible. She called together her senior commanders for a virtual meeting, using the secure communication network that Karen had built. Representatives from resistance cells around the world logged in. Lisa presented her plan. It was desperate, probably suicidal, and would require every resource they had. But if it worked, it would end the war. The plan was simple in concept. The Vacrine depended on their orbital platforms for power projection. Take out those platforms and the Vacrine ground forces would be vulnerable, but getting to the platforms required capturing a Vacrine spacecraft and flying it into orbit. That meant assaulting a starport, one of the most heavily defended locations on the planet. Danny Cooper volunteered his group for the starport assault. He knew it was essentially a suicide mission. The chances of capturing a ship and escaping were minimal, but someone had to do it, and his people were the best qualified. When he told his fighters about the mission, every single one of them volunteered. They spent 2 months preparing. Karen worked on devices that could disable Vacrine security systems. Pete's protege scouted the starport and mapped out every detail. Amy's team trained specifically for close-quarters combat in the confined spaces of a spacecraft. Everyone knew that most of them would not survive. The night before the assault, Danny gathered his people together. He looked at the faces of men and women who had followed him for years. Some had been with him since the beginning. Others were newer but just as committed. He wanted to tell them something meaningful, something that would make sense of the sacrifices they were about to make. But he could not find the words. What could he say? That their deaths would matter? That they were heroes? That humanity would remember them? All of that seemed hollow and meaningless. So instead he told them the truth. They were monsters now, all of them. They had done terrible things and would do more terrible things tomorrow, but those terrible things were necessary. Without monsters like them, humanity would have no chance at all. Karen sat alone in her workshop and looked at the weapons she had created. She thought about the person she used to be, the engineer who built things to help people. That person was gone. In her place was someone who built things to hurt and kill. She wondered if she would ever be able to create something beautiful again, or if her hands were forever stained by the blood of her inventions. Amy cleaned her weapons and checked her equipment for the 100th time. Tomorrow she would lead her team into battle knowing that most of them would die. She should feel something about that. Fear, sadness, regret. But she felt nothing. The war had burned away her ability to feel. She was a weapon now, nothing more. Point her at a target and she would destroy it or be destroyed trying. Lisa Grant sat in her command bunker and waited for dawn. The assault would begin in 6 hours. After that, one of two things would happen. Either Danny's group would succeed in their impossible mission, or they would all die trying. Either way, the war was reaching its climax. Either way, too many people had already been lost. She thought about the person she had been when this started. A colonel in the military who believed in honor and duty and following the rules. That person seemed like a stranger now. The woman she had become had ordered assassinations, approved the use of chemical weapons, and sent countless people to their deaths. All necessary decisions, all unbearable burdens. Somewhere in orbit, Thraka looked down at the planet that had cost him so much. He had lost more soldiers on Earth than in his entire previous career. His reputation in the Empire was in ruins. Other commanders whispered that he had gone soft, that he should have simply destroyed all humans from orbit instead of trying to occupy the planet. But Thraka had pride. He would not admit defeat. He would break these humans or die trying. He ordered his forces to prepare. 5 years after the invasion began, the Vakreen Empire made its final move to crush the human resistance. Massive orbital bombardment platforms appeared in the skies above Earth, weapons powerful enough to destroy entire regions. The message from Thraka was clear: surrender or be exterminated down to the last human. Lisa Grant received the ultimatum in her command bunker. She had 48 hours to respond. 48 hours to decide whether humanity would submit to slavery or face total annihilation. She looked at the message for a long time, then sent out orders to every resistance cell on the planet. No surrender, no mercy. Attack everything. The response was immediate. Resistance fighters around the world launched simultaneous attacks on Vakreen positions. It was coordinated chaos on a scale the aliens had never experienced. Supply depots exploded. Command centers were overrun. Patrols were ambushed in dozens of locations at once. The humans were not trying to win anymore. They were trying to make the Vakreen pay the highest price possible before the orbital platforms reduced Earth to ash. Danny Cooper led his group toward the starport outside of what used to be Atlanta. They had 200 fighters against a facility defended by over 1,000 Vakreen soldiers. The odds were impossible, but impossible had become normal for the resistance. The assault began at dawn. Karen's electronic warfare devices disabled the starport security systems for exactly 4 minutes. That was all the time they would get. Danny's fighters poured through the breached perimeter like a flood. They had trained for months for this moment. Every person knew their role. Every team had a specific target. The fighting was brutal and close. The Vakreen defenders were caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the attack. Human fighters threw themselves at defensive positions with no regard for their own lives. They used suicide tactics, wearing explosives and detonating them in the middle of enemy formations. They cleared rooms with grenades and automatic weapons fire. They took no prisoners. Amy Stevens led her team through the starport's main hangar. Their objective was a Vakreen transport ship that intelligence said was fueled and ready for launch. They fought through 3 defensive lines to reach it. Amy lost half her team in the process, but she kept moving forward. Nothing would stop her from reaching that ship. Danny's team secured the perimeter around the hangar while Karen and a small group of technicians worked on getting the transport operational. Vakreen reinforcements were pouring into the starport now. The defenders had recovered from the initial shock and were mounting a coordinated counterattack. The battle became a desperate holding action. Human fighters fell back toward the hangar, fighting every step of the way. Danny knew they were running out of time. The transport needed another 10 minutes to be ready for launch. They had to hold for 10 more minutes against an enemy that outnumbered them 5 to 1. He grabbed a radio and called for volunteers to hold the main corridor leading to the hangar. 20 fighters stepped forward. They knew it was a death sentence, but they did it anyway. They set up positions at a choke point and prepared to sell their lives dearly. Karen got the transport's engines online. The ship was ready to fly, but they had a problem. Someone needed to pilot it, and none of the humans knew how to fly Valkyrie spacecraft. Karen looked at the alien controls and made a decision. She would learn. She had to. Amy got her remaining team members onto the transport. Wounded fighters were carried aboard. The volunteers holding the corridor were being overrun. Danny could hear their desperate last stand over the radio. Then the transmission stopped. The corridor was lost. Danny ordered everyone still alive to get on the ship. They had maybe 2 minutes before the Valkyrie reached the hangar. He did a quick count. They had started with 200 fighters. Less than 70 were still alive to board the transport. The ship lifted off just as Valkyrie soldiers burst into the hangar. Enemy fire struck the hull, but Karen managed to keep it stable. She aimed the ship at the sky and pushed the engines to maximum. The transport shot upward, breaking through the atmosphere in seconds. Karen had never flown anything before, but she had studied captured Valkyrie manuals for months. She knew the basics. More importantly, she knew where they needed to go. The orbital bombardment platform was their target. It was the key to everything. In orbit, the platform's crew detected the approaching transport. They tried to hail it using Valkyrie protocols. Karen ignored the calls and kept flying. The platform was huge, bigger than any human structure had ever been. It bristled with weapons capable of destroying cities. Danny moved through the transport, checking on his people. They were exhausted, wounded, and traumatized, but they were not done yet. He explained the final phase of the plan. They would board the platform, fight their way to the command center, and turn the platform's weapons against the other orbital installations. Then they would destroy the platform itself. Amy listened to the plan and realized that there was no escape route. Once they were on the platform and started the attack, there would be no way off before it exploded. This was a one-way mission. She looked around at the others and saw that they understood too. No one complained. They had all known from the beginning that they were not coming back. The transport docked with the platform using codes that Karen had extracted from captured systems. The moment the airlock opened, the humans poured out shooting. The Valkyrie crew had no idea that their own transport contained enemy fighters. The surprise was total. Fighting raged through the platform's corridors. The humans used every dirty trick they had learned over 5 years of guerrilla warfare. They set traps. They flanked and ambushed. They used the platform's own systems against the defenders. Slowly, brutally, they fought their way toward the command center. Danny lost count of how many Valkyrie he killed. He lost count of how many of his people died beside him. All that mattered was moving forward, always forward toward their objective. He saw Amy lead a charge through a defended choke point, her team taking heavy casualties but breaking through. He saw Karen rig explosives on critical systems as they passed. He saw heroes die in ways that would never be recorded or remembered. They reached the command center with 12 fighters still alive. 12 out of 200. Danny, Karen, Amy, and 9 others. They blasted through the final door and took control of the platform's weapons. Karen sat at the alien controls and went to work. She had studied these systems. She knew how they operated. Her fingers moved across the interface, inputting commands. The platform's massive weapons began to rotate, targeting the other orbital installations. The Valkyrie fleet realized too late what was happening. The platform opened fire on its sister installations, destroying 2 before they could respond. The remaining platforms returned fire, but Karen had already activated the platform's defenses. A battle began in orbit, giant weapons that could destroy cities now firing on each other. Danny knew they had minutes at most before the platform was destroyed. He gathered the survivors together. They had done it. They had struck a blow that would cripple the Valkyrie ability to bombard Earth from orbit. Whatever happened now, they had given humanity a fighting chance. Karen set the platform's reactor to overload and programmed the weapons to continue firing until the last possible moment. Then she stood up from the controls and looked at the others. She told them that she was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of killing, tired of being a monster. She said that she was going to stay here and make sure the reactor overloaded completely, make sure the Valkyrie could not stop it. Danny tried to argue, but Karen cut him off. She said that there were not enough escape pods for everyone anyway. Someone had to stay. It might as well be her. She had created weapons that killed thousands. She had become a builder of death instead of life. This was her chance to end it on her own terms. The others ran for the escape pods. Karen watched them go, then turned back to the controls. She monitored the weapons fire, making small adjustments to ensure maximum damage to the other platforms. She watched the reactor temperature climb higher and higher. She thought about the person she used to be before the war, before everything changed. The platform's weapons destroyed 2 more orbital installations before the return fire became overwhelming. Hull breaches opened across the station. Karen kept working, kept firing, kept destroying. The reactor reached critical temperature. She had seconds left. Her last thought was a simple one. She hoped it was enough. She hoped humanity would remember why they fought. She hoped that someday people would be able to build instead of destroy. Then the reactor exploded and Karen Walsh, along with the entire bombardment platform, disappeared in a flash of light visible from Earth's surface. Danny and the others watched from their escape pods as the platform exploded. The shockwave destroyed another orbital installation nearby. In total, 5 of the Vakrine's bombardment platforms were gone. The aliens no longer had the overwhelming orbital superiority they needed to destroy Earth. On the ground, Lisa Grant watched the explosions in orbit through a telescope. She received reports from around the planet. The simultaneous attacks had pushed the Vakrine forces to the breaking point. Their supply situation was critical. Their morale was shattered, and now their orbital support was crippled. She sent a message to Thraka. The Vakrine were gone, but Earth was forever changed. The resistance fighters who had saved humanity now faced a different kind of battle. They had to learn how to live in a world that no longer needed monsters. Lisa Grant established a provisional government in what remained of the old capital cities. Her first act was to create a memorial for the fallen. The names of every human who died in the resistance were carved into black stone walls that stretched for miles. Over 2 million names. Some were soldiers. Many were civilians. All had given everything for humanity's survival. Lisa walked along the memorial walls and stopped at certain names. Karen Walsh, Pete Johnson. Hundreds of others she had known personally. Thousands more she had sent to their deaths through her orders. The weight of those decisions would never leave her. The surviving resistance fighters struggled to adapt to peace. They had spent years living in constant danger, always ready to fight or run. Now there were no more missions, no more targets, no more enemies. Many did not know what to do with themselves. Danny Cooper tried to return to civilian life, but it was impossible. He could not sleep without nightmares. He could not be in crowds without scanning for threats. He could not hear loud noises without reaching for weapons that were no longer there. The war was over, but his body and mind had not gotten the message. He met with other former fighters regularly. They gathered in quiet places and talked about their experiences. It helped to be around people who understood. Civilians looked at them with a mixture of gratitude and fear. They knew that these scarred, haunted people had saved the world. They also knew what those people had become in the process. Amy Stevens was lost. At 18, she was a veteran of 5 years of brutal warfare. She had killed more people than she could count. She had led missions that required absolute ruthlessness. Now she was supposed to find a job, make friends, live a normal life. She did not know how to do any of those things. One night, Amy broke down in front of Danny. She said that she felt like a monster pretending to be human. Everyone looked at her and saw a hero, but she knew the truth. She was a killer who happened to fight for the right side. That did not make her any less of a monster. Danny told her something he had learned the hard way. They were all monsters now. Every person who had fought in the resistance had done things that would horrify normal people. But they had done those things so that normal people could continue to exist. That was the price they paid, and they would carry it for the rest of their lives. The provisional government faced difficult questions about justice and accountability. Some humans had collaborated with the Vakrine during the occupation. They had provided information, helped identify resistance members, worked in Vakrine facilities. Now that the war was over, what should be done with them? Lisa Grant knew that many resistance fighters wanted revenge. They wanted the collaborators punished, executed like traitors. But she also knew that not everyone who worked with the Vakrine had a choice. Some did it to protect their families. Some did it to survive. Drawing a line between collaboration and survival was nearly impossible. She established tribunals to review each case individually. Some collaborators were found guilty of genuine crimes and punished. Others were given lighter sentences or pardoned. It was not perfect justice, but it was the best they could do in a broken world. The resistance fighters themselves faced scrutiny. Human rights organizations, reformed now that the war was over, began investigating war crimes committed by the resistance, the use of chemical weapons, the torture of prisoners, the assassination of civilians, the suicide attacks in populated areas. Lisa received reports detailing operations she had approved during the war. Operations that had killed Vakrine soldiers but also human bystanders. Operations that used tactics banned by every convention of civilized warfare. She read the reports and felt nothing. She had made those decisions. She would make them again if necessary. That was the burden of command. But some of the younger fighters struggled with guilt. They had done terrible things in the heat of war. Things that seemed necessary at the time. Now in the cold light of peace, those actions haunted them. Therapy programs were established to help veterans cope, but many refused to attend. They felt they did not deserve help. They felt they deserved to suffer for what they had become. Danny organized support groups for veterans who were having trouble adjusting. The groups met weekly in community centers and churches. No civilians were allowed. Only people who had fought in the resistance. Only people who understood what it meant to be a monster. In these meetings, people talked honestly about their experiences. They admitted the things they had done. They cried for the people they had killed and the people they had lost. They tried to make sense of a war that had turned them into something they no longer recognized. One veteran talked about how he had executed 3 human collaborators in front of their families to send a message. He said he did not regret it at the time. The collaborators had given information that led to the deaths of resistance fighters. They deserved to die. But now he could not stop thinking about the children who watched their parents be killed. What kind of person does that? What kind of monster? Another veteran talked about a mission where her team burned down a building with Vakrine soldiers inside. They blocked the exits and listened to the aliens scream as they died. It was effective. It was necessary. But she could still hear those screams every night when she tried to sleep. Amy Stevens rarely spoke in these meetings. She listened to others share their stories and felt a strange disconnect. She did not feel guilty about the things she had done. She did not have nightmares or flashbacks. She just felt empty, like all her emotions had been burned away during the war. She wondered if that made her worse than the others or just different. The world tried to move forward. Cities were rebuilt. Governments were reformed. Schools reopened. Life went on. But the scars of the war ran deep, and some scars never healed. Lisa Grant tried to retire from public life, but people kept asking her to lead. They wanted her to be president, to be the face of the new Earth. She refused. She had made too many terrible decisions to be a symbol of hope. Let someone else lead the rebuilding. She would live with her memories in private. She visited the memorial often, standing in front of Karen Walsh's name. Karen had been brilliant and kind before the war. The conflict had turned her into a builder of weapons, a creator of death. In the end, she had sacrificed herself to destroy the Vakrine orbital platforms. Was that redemption or just more tragedy? Lisa never found an answer to that question. She just stood at the memorial and whispered apologies to people who could no longer hear them. Danny Cooper eventually found a purpose. He started working with troubled youth, kids who had grown up during the war and learned violence as a way of life. He taught them that there were other ways to live, even if he struggled to follow that advice himself. One day, a young man came to Danny asking for help. The young man had been a child soldier in the resistance, recruited at age 12. Now he was 17, and did not know how to function in normal society. He had violent outbursts. He could not hold a job. He felt like a monster. Danny looked at this kid and saw himself. He saw Amy and all the other young fighters who had their childhood stolen by the war. He told the young man something true and painful. They were monsters. The war had made them into creatures that could kill without hesitation. But monsters could choose what they did with that nature. They could use their strength to protect people instead of hurt them. They could use their skills to teach others to defend themselves. They could carry the burden of their past and try to make the present a little better. It would never erase what they had done. It would never make them normal. But it was something. Amy Stevens found work as a security consultant, teaching people and organizations how to protect themselves. She was good at it. She understood tactics and threat assessment in ways that most people never would, but she kept everyone at a distance. She had no close friends, no relationships, no real connections to anyone. One night, she stood on the roof of her building and looked out at the rebuilt city. Lights glowed in windows. People went about their lives. They were happy, or at least trying to be, and she had helped make that possible. She and thousands of other monsters had fought and killed and died so that normal people could be normal. She thought about jumping off the roof. It would be easy. She would not have to be a monster anymore. She would not have to pretend to be human. But then she thought about Karen Walsh, who had chosen to die for a purpose. If Amy was going to die, it should mean something. So she stepped back from the edge and went back inside. 10 years after the war ended, Earth had mostly recovered. The population was smaller, and the scars were still visible, but humanity survived. New generations were born who had no memory of the Vacrine invasion. Life went on. Lisa Grant died of old age at 73. Her funeral was attended by thousands, including most of the surviving resistance fighters. They buried her at the memorial with a simple inscription. She did what was necessary. Danny Cooper lived to see his grandchildren born. He never told them about the things he did during the war. Let them think of him as a kind old man who told stories and gave good advice.